Vandalism and looting in the Reformation.
Regarding the attitude towards the Reformation, the Internet overwhelmingly praises it. Even AI chatbots hail the success of the Reformation. However, there is almost no reflection on the vandalism, looting, and acts of war that occurred during the movement. Actually, it's not surprising that chatbots have a political stance. After all, their thinking originates from online text information scraped from all websites using web crawlers. Therefore, their behavior also serves as a wake-up call for the Catholic Church. After all, the Internet is a crucial battleground for public opinion. Protestantism has occupied this position, thus holding a strategic advantage in public discourse. The Catholic Church has failed to keep pace with the times and abandoned the online front, which is equivalent to tacitly accepting all unfavorable accusations from the outside. The Catholic Church's default acceptance of guilt is entirely detrimental to the ecumenical movement. This is because if guilt is established, then the division of religion becomes a just act of the Reformation. Therefore, solely for the sake of the universal Christian ecumenical movement, both Protestantism and Catholicism must have the courage to undergo painful self-correction and the determination to go to extremes to negate the Reformation's damage to Christian unity.
The Reformation and Iconoclasm.
Within the Reformation movement, there existed some severe and deplorable acts of vandalism and destruction, reminiscent of the Red Guards during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. This was particularly prevalent in radical Protestant areas. These actions primarily manifested as the iconoclasm, a movement aimed at destroying statues, images, relics, and other items considered idolatrous within Catholic churches and other religious sites. These acts of vandalism and looting mainly occurred in what is now the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland. The destruction of statues and religious paintings in the Our Lady Cathedral of Antwerp, Belgium, by radical Calvinist Protestants in 1566, is a typical example of the iconoclasm. During the French Wars of Religion, the Huguenots, French Calvinist Protestants, also carried out numerous acts of iconoclasm, often clashing with Catholics in the process. The iconoclasm caused severe damage to medieval religious art, with many precious artworks being destroyed during the movement. The Netherlands, as one of the cultural centers of the Middle Ages, was particularly affected. In the Netherlands, the iconoclasm is considered the outbreak of conflict between the Calvinist Dutch and the Catholic Spanish rulers, directly leading to the subsequent 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War of Independence. The Red Guard-style iconoclasm is anti-biblical. This is because the destroyers often cited the commandment from the Old Testament's book of Exodus, "You shall not make for yourselves an image, in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them, or worship them. For the first, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." The destroyers believed that the statues, images, and other religious artworks in churches violated this commandment against idolatry. However, critics argue that this interpretation deliberately ignores the original context, which targeted other deities, is overly literal, and is a typical example of rampant metaphysics, taking verses out of context, deliberately distorting their meaning, and intentionally overlooking examples in the Old Testament, where God instructed the creation of sacred objects, such as the cherubim, on the Ark of the Covenant, as well as the acceptance of the symbolic meaning of images in the New Testament. The New Testament emphasizes inner faith and spiritual communion with God, rather than external material worship. Critics argue that the iconoclasts overemphasized the removal of external religious artworks, while neglecting the importance of cultivating genuine faith and understanding religious symbolism. The New Testament does not explicitly forbid or require the destruction of existing religious artworks, but rather focuses on the inner transformation of believers. Jesus himself did not initiate or teach the destruction of artworks or statues in Jewish or Roman culture at the time. Early Christians also incorporated religious symbols and artistic expressions in their meeting places and tombs, indicating their attitude towards images. Critics argue that religious art has always played an important role in Christian tradition, serving as a medium For teaching biblical stories, inspiring devotional feelings in believers and connecting them with religious history, the iconoclasm denied the symbolic and educational value of these images, simply viewing them as objects of idolatry. The iconoclasm was often accompanied by violence and the destruction of cultural heritage, which contradicts the Christian spirit of charity, peace, and unity. It also frequently led to social and religious division and conflict. Therefore, from the perspective of emphasizing the spirit of the New Testament, understanding the symbolic meaning of religious art, and opposing violence and destruction, many believe that the iconoclasm was contrary to the overall spirit of the Bible and was a one-sided and extreme interpretation of certain biblical passages. They argue that a more biblically consistent approach would be to guide believers in correctly understanding and using religious images, rather than simply destroying them. Iconoclasm has no solid biblical basis and no resolutions from ecumenical councils. It was merely the personal opinion of some intellectuals. In terms of organizational principles, individuals must obey the collective, and the minority must obey the majority. Therefore, the violent acts of destroying icons were unreasonable. After all, human words don't count, only God's words count. Those intellectuals belong to humanity, not to God. Therefore, before the supporting resolutions of ecumenical councils emerged, iconoclasm was certainly illegal.
The significance of icons.
The idols spoken of in the Bible clearly refer to evil spirits and false gods, not to the sacred symbolic representations of the Creator in the Bible. Icons are not equivalent to idols, but possess symbolic meaning that can help believers understand and worship God, as well as biblical figures and stories, more profoundly. They are the Bible for the illiterate, capable of teaching those who cannot read. Since God permitted the creation of certain symbolic objects in the Old Testament, such as the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, then depicting the images of Christ and the saints, naturally follows the same principle, for Christ is the embodiment of God incarnate. While the New Testament does not explicitly command the creation or veneration of icons, neither does it explicitly forbid all forms of iconic art. The New Testament emphasizes inner faith rather than outward forms. Icons have a long-standing place in Christian history and tradition, considered an important part of expressing faith. Take the cross, for example. Jesus' body is the main subject, and the cross is the supporting element. A crucifix, a cross with Jesus' body, has a clear meaning, immediately understandable to those who see it. A bare cross, without Jesus' body, has a less clear meaning. After all, many people were crucified, and certainly, there were fewer righteous individuals than criminals among them. Therefore, the meaning of such a cross becomes a matter of individual interpretation. Those who destroy icons emphasize that the early church did not venerate icons. This is judging the ancients through modern eyes, another typical example of metaphysics. After all, ancient people did not have the artistic heritage and tools of modern times. Mass production of icons was impossible. Painting at that time was not done with colored pencils and paints, but by assembling and adhering purely natural colored pebbles. This art is called mosaic. Visiting St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican will make this abundantly clear.
The Reformers' attitude towards iconoclasm.
The leaders of the Reformation did not have a completely unified stance on vandalism and looting, particularly the iconoclasm. However, overall, they held a cautious, or even opposing attitude towards these unauthorized and uncontrolled acts of youthful radical violence. Martin Luther, while opposing certain practices in Catholicism that he considered idolatrous, strongly opposed the use of violent means to remove religious images. He believed that changes in faith should come through teaching and persuasion, not through coercion and destruction. When he witnessed radical iconoclastic acts in Wittenberg, he was deeply disturbed and delivered sermons condemning such behavior, emphasizing order and social stability. He argued that images themselves were not dangerous. The danger lay in people's incorrect worship of them. He advocated for gradually changing people's views through the preaching of the gospel. John Calvin held a very extreme position on religious images. He believed that religious statues and paintings were inherently idolatrous and must be removed. However, he insisted that these removals should be carried out by legitimate church or government authorities, not by individuals or mobs acting on their own. Although Calvin's ideas, to some extent inspired later iconoclastic movements, he himself did not condone disorderly and violent acts of destruction. He emphasized discipline and order, believing that any reform should take place within a legal framework. Ulrich Zwingli, when promoting the Reformation in Zurich, also advocated for the removal of idols from churches. Similar to Calvin, he believed this should be an officially led action. In Zurich, the removal of religious images was carried out gradually and relatively orderly under the command of the city authorities. Zwingli himself also did not approve of unauthorized violent acts. However, icons are decorations that embellish churches and cathedrals. The result of those Red Guard-style iconoclastic movements is evident in the later built Protestant churches. Simplicity to the extreme, bare walls unable to compare to the solemnity, grandeur, and magnificence of Catholic churches. This difference in atmosphere is often one of the important reasons why Protestants convert to Catholicism.
Mob violence during the Reformation.
Beyond iconoclasm, the Reformation movement was accompanied by other forms of vandalism and looting. These actions were often intertwined with social unrest, religious conflict, and challenges to existing power structures. In some regions, particularly where Protestant forces gained dominance, the property of monasteries and Catholic churches was viewed as symbolic of the old regime and ill-gotten gains. Some radicals and local nobles seized the opportunity to encroach upon and plunder this property, including land, buildings, gold, silver, jewelry, and other assets, much of which were donations from believers' inheritances. This thuggish behavior of looting was not only a moral transgression, but also involved the trampling of the law. In some areas of intense conflict, Catholic clergy became targets of personal attacks. Their residences might be raided, personal belongings looted, and even their personal safety threatened. Some clergy were stripped of all their possessions and driven out. The Reformation triggered numerous religious wars, such as the French Wars of Religion, the Dutch War of Independence, the 80 Years' War. The Netherlands region encompasses present-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and the later 30 Years' War. During these wars, with the breakdown of order and emotional frenzy, both Protestant and Catholic armies might engage in rampant looting, not only targeting opposing religious institutions and personnel, but also civilians. This was more prevalent in the context of war, but its roots still lay in religious conflict. The spread of Reformation ideas often stirred up popular religious sentiments. In some places, this escalated into public riots and conflicts, during which shops, houses, and even churches might be vandalized and looted. In addition to icons within churches, some radicals also targeted other items considered idolatrous for destruction, such as objects used in religious processions and relics of saints. The extent and scope of these acts of vandalism and looting varied across different regions and periods. Some areas completed the Reformation relatively peacefully, while others were accompanied by significant violence. Furthermore, these actions were often influenced by complex social, political, and economic factors, not solely by purely religious motivations. Some nobles and local powers used the Reformation as a pretext to seize power and wealth. While the iconoclasm was the most representative act of vandalism during the Reformation, it was not the only manifestation. The encroachment upon the property of religious institutions, attacks on clergy, and the Robin Hood-style looting during religious conflicts constituted a part of the social upheaval of the Reformation era.
Comparing the Reformation and the Cultural Revolution.
The Reformation and the Cultural Revolution are two distinct historical movements that profoundly impacted their respective societies. Although they occurred in different historical contexts and had different ideologies, comparing them can help us understand some common characteristics of social change, rather than painstakingly trying to Imagine the Reformation movement. It is more efficient to simply apply the model of China's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. The Reformation originated from the rebellion of a scholar. The Cultural Revolution originated from the planning of a leader. The Reformation emphasized a certain scholar's personal will as truth. The Cultural Revolution emphasized that rebellion is justified, rebelling for the sake of rebelling. The Reformation, when out of control, led to insubordination and extreme liberalism. The Cultural Revolution, when out of control, led to strikes, school boycotts, and market shutdowns. Both the Reformation and the Cultural Revolution, when further out of control, resulted in large-scale vandalism and looting. The Reformation occurred in localized areas. The Cultural Revolution occurred across the entire land of China. The Reformation led to several religious wars. The Cultural Revolution, although involving conflict, did not result in wars. The Reformation resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands to millions of people. The Cultural Revolution also resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands to millions of people, but tens of millions more suffered political persecution. The Reformation lasted for 130 years. The Cultural Revolution lasted for 10 years. The Reformation led many to doubt religion and the meaning of life. The Cultural Revolution led many to skepticism and doubt truth. Both were genetic mutations in the development of human society, both causing crises of faith and a regression of civilization.
The secular authorities' control over vandalism and looting.
The attitude of secular authorities towards vandalism and looting during the Reformation was a complex issue that varied across different regions and periods. Generally speaking, the secular authorities operated under a principle of the union of church and state, so their specific attitude depended on their disposition. Some monarchs, for their own political and economic interests, chose to support the Reformation. Therefore, they adopted a relatively tolerant, or even tacitly approving attitude towards the vandalism and looting carried out by Protestants against Catholic idolatry, especially in the early stages of the movement, viewing it as part of overthrowing the old order. However, once the vandalism and looting spiraled out of control, threatening social stability and their rule, they would certainly take strong measures to control it. Monarchs loyal to Catholicism, such as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the French kings, would severely suppress Protestant violence, viewing it as rebellion and a challenge to sacred tradition and order. They deployed police and armies to uphold Catholic authority and severely punished the mobs involved in vandalism and looting. Some rulers attempted to remain neutral between Catholicism and Protestantism to seek a balance between the two. They tolerated the Reformation to a certain extent, but when violent acts sufficiently threatened public order, they would intervene to maintain social order. Of course, regardless of the ruler's own religious stance, maintaining social order was always an important responsibility of the secular authorities. Large-scale vandalism and looting, especially the seizure of church and monastery property, often led to severe social unrest and conflict, threatening the ruler's authority. Therefore, when vandalism and looting went out of control and spilled over, secular authorities usually took strict measures to suppress them. The Reformation was often intertwined with the political power struggles of the time. Some nobles and local powers would use religious conflict to weaken the centralized power of the Holy Roman Empire and expand their own influence. In these cases, the secular authorities' attitude towards vandalism and looting would also be influenced by political considerations. They might initially exploit or even condone violent acts and then suppress them after achieving their goals, thereby absolving themselves of responsibility for their previous tolerance. In the German territories, during the early stages of the Reformation, some princes who supported Luther tolerated the destruction of Catholic Church property. However, after the violence spiraled out of control and triggered the Peasants' War, the social unrest drastically worsened, and many reformers, including Luther himself, called on the secular authorities to carry out strong suppression. The iconoclasm of year 1566 intensified the contradictions between the Netherlands and the Spanish rulers, ultimately leading to the 80 Years' War. The Spanish authorities initially tried to suppress these acts, but were unsuccessful due to military setbacks. In the different phases of the English Reformation, the attitude of the secular authorities towards religious property also changed. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries and confiscation of their property was a top-down action, while popular vandalism and looting were met with varying degrees of tolerance or suppression. During the French Wars of Religion, violent conflicts between Huguenots and Catholics were constant, and the attitude of the royal court varied depending on the political situation, sometimes attempting to mediate, and sometimes siding with one party to carry out suppression.
Attitudes within Christianity.
The three major branches of Christianity have maintained largely consistent attitudes towards the vandalism and violence of several centuries ago. The Catholic Church views the Reformation as a fundamental act of disobedience against its ecclesiastical authority and sacred beliefs. Therefore, it naturally holds a strong stance of condemnation towards the violent acts that occurred within it. The Catholic Church considers the iconoclastic and other violent actions of Protestants as a desecration of sacred faith and blatant heresy, viewing them as a significant threat to religious order and social stability. To counter this, the Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation, aiming to combat Protestant rebellion and uphold Catholic authority. This included the suppression of Protestant violent acts. The Eastern Orthodox Church, geographically located mainly in Eastern Europe, had no direct involvement with the Reformation movement in Western Europe. The Eastern Orthodox Church itself did not experience similar violent upheavals. Although they did not directly participate in the movement, the Eastern Orthodox Church certainly took notice of the internal fracturing of the Western Christian world. They would have viewed the violence and destruction as a consequence of the Western churches deviating from Orthodox faith. However, the Eastern Orthodox Church also highly values church tradition and icons. Therefore, they hold an absolutely negative view of Protestant iconoclasm, considering it a mad desecration of religious symbols. Within Protestantism itself, attitudes towards vandalism and looting were not entirely uniform. Some radical Protestants, particularly followers of Calvinism, believed that the removal of items considered idolatrous from churches was necessary and an important component of the Reformation. Consequently, they actively participated in, and even spearheaded the iconoclastic movement.
Reflections on the Reformation.
The Reformation movement was a combination of three independent aspects. One. Due to liberal intellectual trends, some naive scholars were audacious enough to publicly post broadsides, thereby triggering a cultural revolution. It would have been strange if such a democracy movement hadn't gone out of control. 2. The development of this cultural revolution continuously spiraled out of control, evolving into a movement of vandalism and looting. In reality, some unscrupulous individuals mixed in, not for religious reasons, but to take advantage of the chaos to seek revenge on society. 3. Some princes, who were clearly against the cultural revolution, later changed their stance, using the chaos as an opportunity to break away from the Holy See. This was the true driving force behind the division of Christianity. This means that vandalism, looting, and war were not the initial intentions of the Reform movement's prominent scholars, and the great schism of Christianity was even more something these scholars vehemently dreaded. Therefore, it is unfair, and even a deliberate framing, for later generations to turn the righteous deeds of vandalism, looting, and burning, the greatness of dividing religion, all into halos above the heads of these scholars. For example, Martin Luther stated multiple times his opposition to the division of Christianity. Yet history still fashions the immortal achievement of dividing Christianity into a grand medal hung around Luther's neck. Martin Luther explicitly stated his opposition to naming churches after himself. Yet later generations, following the reckless tradition of the rebels, still use his name to designate the denomination Lutheranism. The great schism of Christianity, caused by the Reformation, went against the initial intentions of the Reformed scholars. Later Protestant leaders and church fathers, facing the Bible's teachings on unity and reflecting on the serious negative impact of the schism on Christianity, deeply regretted their actions and had no choice but to adopt reverse thinking, calling for reunification. The ecumenical movement is, in fact, a partial or comprehensive negation of the Reformation movement. However, to mend a broken mirror requires a theoretical basis. Relying solely on the slogans of church fathers is clearly insufficient. After all, the beliefs of the Reformation movement have taken deep root in the hearts of Protestants. Without negating the Reformation movement, the unity movement will forever remain mere words on paper.
Excising the poison for the sake of Christian unity.
To promote the ecumenical movement, advocated by Protestant leaders, it is necessary to once again expose the vandalism and looting during the Reformation. This can serve as a wake-up call for descendants who have long been indoctrinated with a one-sided orthodox view. Emphasizing the comprehensiveness of history helps to break down biased, heroic, and deifying propaganda, enabling later generations to understand history more fully and objectively. If the descendants of certain denominations hold an absolutely positive view of the Reformation while completely ignoring its negative aspects, then facing these negative behaviors can help them shed historical baggage and view the relationship between different Christian traditions more rationally. Acknowledging historical errors can promote a return to reason, a more humble and just reflection on one's own history, and lay a theoretical foundation for more sincere dialogue and unity. Revealing the violence caused by historical religious fanaticism can serve as a warning, reminding contemporary Christians to be vigilant against extremism and exclusionary ideologies. The Reformation movement is a controversial and painful topic in Christian history. Different denominations and sects have different emotional connections to this period. Re-exposing these negative events will certainly cause discomfort, anger, and backlash. However, to achieve the unity taught in the Bible, it is necessary to undergo painful self-correction. The ancient wisdom must be practiced. To correct a deviation, one must go to the extreme. Without going to the extreme, the deviation cannot be corrected. The goal of the ecumenical movement is to seek unity in faith, love, and mission, thereby aligning more closely with biblical teachings rather than achieving selfish desires through blaming or negating each other's history. Emphasizing common ground and mutual understanding will be more effective. When judging historical actions, it is necessary to consider the historical context and social environment of the time. Simply using today's standards to judge the past can lead to confusion and misunderstanding.
Epilogue.
The vandalism and looting of that time were not only a disgrace to Protestantism, but also a wound for all Christians. After all, it disfigured the credibility of Christianity. Some Christians abandoned their faith due to disappointment. Some non-Christians sneered in disgust. History is written by the victors, not necessarily by the wise. Therefore, to face history squarely, the wise certainly adhere to the principle of listening to both sides, leads to clarity, while believing only one side leads to blindness. Regarding the vandalism and looting during the Reformation within Protestantism, due to it being a negative aspect of their own history, it will never be promoted. On the Catholic side, due to the principle of harmony is precious, it will also never be publicized. Only activists for the universal Christian ecumenical movement will be willing to undergo such painful self-correction. After all, drastic measures are needed for a serious illness. The unity of universal Christianity is indeed as difficult as ascending to heaven because, without the coercive means of secular power, no one is willing to abandon their own truth to cater to the truth of others. However, it is also as easy as turning one's hand, as long as Christians possess lofty wisdom and awareness. A collective vote would bring about unity the next day.